Number 30. What is the difference between righteousness by works and righteousness by faith? Can we obey God and be free at the same time? In the series, Faith, Righteousness, and Salvation by Maxwell, recorded June 5, 1975.
Well, before we begin, should we ask the Lord to guide us in our study this evening? Our loving Father in heaven, we're grateful for the privilege we have had of meeting together these several weeks to study once again the infinitely gracious provisions for saving us sinners, healing and restoring us, and giving us back all that we lost in the beginning and even more besides. We pray that we may have learned something that is true, and most of all, that our admiration for Thee, our faith in Thee, may have been strengthened, not only for our own good, but that we may be more useful to others. Bless us tonight as we consider some things left over to put it all together. We ask for Thy guidance in our discussion this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. I listed all kinds of things that might be useful and appropriate in the light of the discussions that we've had. Probably the fairest thing would be to say, since I intended to have more time for questions and discussion and usually talk most of the time myself, it would be to simply open the floor for questions and discussion. But let me suggest some questions to start with. Is it possible to define the difference clearly enough between the way of salvation described as righteousness by works or legalism and the method described in the Bible as salvation by faith, righteousness by faith, a phrase that is receiving more emphasis among us at the present time, surely, righteousness by faith. Can we distinguish between the two? If someone asks you for the difference between righteousness by faith and legalism, or righteousness by faith and righteousness by works, do you have a response that you find satisfies people, or more than that, satisfies you when you give it? Is it even possible to define legalism clearly? And can one define it so clearly that one can know when one is tending toward legalism, with all the hazards thereunto appertaining? When you say so-and-so is a legalist, what do you mean? Yes?
I heard on the broadcast last night, Pillars of Faith, someone had written in and asked the question, what was the difference between faith and works?
Yes.
And he said, well, it was like being in a rowboat with two oars, and the oars being faith and works. And if you use nothing but faith, you are apt to go in a circle. And if you use nothing but works, you'd end up in a reverse circle. But by using them both together, you can progress.
What do you think of that illustration? Because all illustrations have limitations, don't they? Does it mean we're saved half by faith and half by works?
If you have faith, you're going to have some works to show for your faith.
Now, that's the problem with the illustration. All illustrations have these problems. In other words, you can't have the faith or without having the works or, so the illustration doesn't hold up. See, the suggestion there is you could have the faith or and be pulling for all your worth and not have the works or. Now, what kind of faith is that? In other words, that's a dead or. It would suggest that the faith or doesn't have any power to pull the boat without the works or. I'm not suggesting that isn't a useful illustration. It's just that all illustrations have this problem of making one point and raising lots of other problems while clarifying, illustrating one. That would show the balance in the book of James. Faith without works is ineffective and dead. That would be correct.
The thing that lets us know the difference between whether we are legalists or not is that there is an inner compulsion that we want to do the right thing. We want to do the Christian thing.
What would righteousness by works be then?
I don't think that there's any such thing. You can't.
That would be a fair way to answer it. There's no such thing as achieving righteousness by works. All right. How would you define the attempt to earn salvation by works? What is that?
I think it has to be rooted first in misunderstanding.
How can you tell if a person is attempting to achieve righteousness by works?
I don't think I can.
How do you spot that?
I don't think I can, except in myself.
How could you recognize it in yourself? What would you look for?
I'd look for how much was inner desire and how much was I better do this or else.
How would you know the inner desire was a good desire?
I'd line it up with, you mean that it was...
Well, does your inner desire to be saved make sure that you're not a legalist?
No. No, I think that you...
Does your inner desire even to please God keep you from being a legalist?
No.
What inner desire would keep you from being a legalist?
the desire to do the right thing.
Would you suggest then that one mark of a non-legalist is that he does what's right because it is right?
I think it goes beyond that. I
All
think
right.
he does what's right because it feels right within him to do it.
Maybe he can't trust his feelings.
Well, he can if he's aligned with the Word and if he is sincerely, if he has the indwelling Spirit.
This
I know.
is
How does he
assuming
know?
quite a little. In other words, if I'm a saint, then I won't be a legalist.
I guess so. I'm not sure what a saint is.
How do I get to be a saint? Some people try to be saints by being legalists. There is a legalistic way of trying to be a saint. Of course, as you mentioned semantics, what is a saint?
I really haven't known. I hear people referring to the little saints in the front row at church, and
Yes.
I don't,
And Paul addresses the sinners in Corinth as saints and then goes on to describe some dreadful things they were doing. But he addressed his letter to the saints in Corinth. So what is a saint? The thing is, we do use these words quite often. We use the term legalist. Say so-and-so is legalistic. That's a legalistic approach to it. We know that we Adventists are often described as legalists by some of our best Christian friends. When they say we're legalists, what do we understand ourselves to be? What is one of these things? And we're often criticized for attempting righteousness by works, salvation by works. That Adventists stress works too much. What is too much stress on works? Is it possible to stress faith too much at the expense of works? Maybe these aren't useful words. Yes.
Faith is putting your belief to work.
What if you believe the wrong thing? That is a definition of faith. I mean, cannibals have that kind of faith too. In days gone by, young Indian youths who felt they had to have a scalp or two to prove they were men, they did it. Conscientious. One would want to add a little more content to that, doing what one believes, wouldn't one? Because one can believe all kinds of things.
What about one refusing to believe the right thing?
How would you apply that to the legalists, say?
Well, there's legalists, and then again, there's legalists. It all depends.
You mean there are
on-
good legalists and bad legalists? Do you think maybe there are savable legalists and unsavable legalists?
Well,
Can any legalist be saved?
I wouldn't know for sure, but I would venture an opinion that yes.
Unchanged? You mean a former legalist? Will some enter the kingdom as legalists? And they will arrive in the kingdom, legalists, they will look over the premises.
Well, then again, what really would constitute a legalist? A legalist
That's
in the
it.
strict sense of a word who follows the scripture to the letter? Or would not a legalist be someone who, let's say, in the presence of undisputable proof, I hate to take an example, but let's say jewelry.
Yes.
What happens if, going through the Old Testament and the New Testament, a person is shown through scriptures that jewelry should not be worn, but they work their way around it? Now, this person could say, well, you're a legalist. But then again, the person who has been called a legalist could say, well, how can you call yourself X name of this religion because you are not doing what the religion states to do?
Could a person be dedicated to obeying every prescription in Scripture and not be a legalist? Or is this willingness to obey every detail in the blueprint, is that what marks a person a legalist? In other words, a legalist, the more legalistic you are, the more obedient you are. Is this true?
Just,
Don't you find shortly after attempting definitions we have to take some illustrations? So let's take some cases in a minute here and decide what legalism would be. Yes?
One done out of fear and one done out of love.
Now, this is getting back to the motivation suggestion, isn't it, that you made? Is there something different in the attitude and the motivation of the legalist that distinguishes inevitably the quality even of his obedience? It's rather hard to read the motivation, and sometimes it's hard to discern the difference in the quality of the obedience. And yet there is an important difference. Maybe we should even ask this: is it serious to be a legalist? Does it matter very much? So long as you're obedient, does it matter whether you're a legalist or not? So long as you're obedient. I mean, what does it really matter? So long as we do what we're told. Isn't that the big thing? Is this very important that we be free? But I mean, isn't obedience the big thing? That everybody will line up and do exactly what he's told. Then we have order in the universe. Why does it have to be willing? I mean, so long as we're good. I mean, on the highway, for safety's sake, when a man stops at the stop sign at a busy intersection, do you mind whether he has stopped there for the right reason or the wrong reason, so long as he's stopped? I mean, isn't the important thing that he stopped? You see, do you care whether it's out of concern for you, he sees you coming and out of concern he stops, or he's afraid he'll get a ticket. Do you care what the motivation is, so long as he stops? This is very dangerous too, you see.
If he's afraid of getting a ticket, then when if a policeman's around, he'll stop. But if he's no policeman around, he might run it, and there could be an accident.
Yes.
Stop out of love.
In other words, you can't trust this man if he only stops for fear of a ticket. Because when that signboard has been taken down and the highway patrolman can no longer hide behind it, and he can see 2 miles in each direction, and he knows there's no policeman around unless he's hidden a gopher hole somewhere, he'll go through. You can't trust the man who obeys for the wrong reason. Would this be part of it? Yes.
I was just thinking of an illustration. It makes a lot of difference from the father's viewpoint. If I were sick and in bed, and I called my daughter and I said, honey, I want a glass of water. And if she, thinking that I was a firm and a stern dad that would whip her if I didn't bring the water, and she came running with it, then she'd be a legalist. But yet if she came because she loves me and because she wanted to give me that drink of water and she wanted to be obedient, then she wouldn't. That would be the faith that she would have in me as her dad. And she would be doing it because of our relationship, not because of the fear of reprimand or reprisal or anything like that. And I think it makes the same difference to God. We could be very obedient, not because we know him and know what kind of a God he really is and how much he loves us, and his patience, his understanding for us gives us this feeling through faith that we want to serve him. But if we do it just because we fear that we're going to be condemned or we're going to die, then we're getting, I think, into that legalistic area.
Let's try this then. If our motivation for obedience is a desire to please God because we love him, would that be a complete cure for legalism? You couldn't be a legalist if you did the things that God has asked us to do because we love him and we really want to please him. If you were listening to your children talking behind the door sometime, and they were talking about whether or not they should do what they're told at home, say, and you'd hear them saying to each other, we'd better be extra good the next week because it's only 1 week to Christmas, and if you want to get your presents, you'd better be good. And besides, you know what Daddy does when we're bad, and so you'd hear them resolving to be good for fear of punishment and desire for reward. Now that might produce order at home, but you wouldn't be very pleased with it. But supposing instead you heard the children talking and saying, why don't we all agree that we will obey Mother and Father in every detail? I mean, they've been so good to us. And besides, they're getting old. I mean, they deserve a happy home. We're only going to be home a few years longer. Now, even though we think a lot of their rules are ridiculous, why don't we agree that so long as we're home, we, out of love for them and gratitude for them and a desire to make them happy, we will be obedient. Would you be pleased? But you would know that as soon as they left home, they'd throw those silly rules out because they were obeying to please you, not because the rules made sense. In other words, those rules had no authority. What was moving them was they wanted to please their parents. They wanted to show gratitude to their parents. And I felt through the years that we have settled for that as the opposite of legalism. See, I'll say, I do what I do as a Seventh-day Adventist, as a Christian, because God has told me to, and he has the power to reward and destroy. Always say, that's legalism. Although, when we read Deuteronomy, you remember, God would say, if you're good, I'll bless you. If you're bad, I'll punish you. I'll discipline you. We sometimes have to talk that way to our children. It's not right, though, for grown-ups to talk this way, though Job's friends came and gave him precisely that explanation. So we say, here's the opposite now of legalism. I do what I do as a Christian and as a Seventh-day Adventist because God has told me to, and I love him, and I want to please him. Now, that's why I don't smoke. I understand it doesn't please God if I smoke. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with smoking, but I don't want to displease God. And he deserves my obedience. So I do all these things, not because they make any sense, but because I want to please him, and I really owe it to him. And there comes a sense of obligation. And you know, there can be mixed with love a very heavy sense of obligation. I mean, we kind of owe it to God that he's done all this for us. So I'm going to be good, not because it makes sense, not because in itself it's right, but because he really deserves my obedience. I ought to do it. Now, that could be almost worse than the other. When I feel my children have been obeying me all these years, and now I found the reason. They just want to make me happy. And they don't believe in this at all, and as soon as I'm dead and gone, or they're off on their own, they're going to go their own way. And I realize I have no more security in that obedience than I have in the first. So obedience number one and obedience number two, I think, are equally objectionable, though there are some qualities to number two that sound a little better. I mean, we do love God, and we do want to please Him, and we do feel grateful. In fact, we almost feel a certain obligation. Don't you really? I mean, we owe Him everything. But how can we progress from obedience number two to another quality? Yes.
The point that I may have not expressed properly was that when you love Him and understand Him, then you realize that all of the things that He wants you to do are things that are for your benefit. And it's not as if you're just, as you say, wanting to please Him, because naturally He has provided a plan of salvation.
Sure.
But through this plan, He has also provided the most happy way of life if you will follow. And so when you evaluate what He has, His plan, it's the most perfect, the best, the most reasonable. And therefore, your understanding is, how could I do anything else but it? It's not that you're forced into it, but it's the ultimate way to go.
Yeah, just to imagine an illustration, if two parents were killed on the highway, since we've been talking about highways, and after the funeral, they could, which of course they couldn't, they could hear their children sitting together in conference and deciding what they're going to do, and find the children agreeing that the way their folks directed the home was the best way to do it, and they were going to continue it. Not just in honor of the memory of their parents, but just happens to be the best way to do it. I think this is one honor. We do extend our parents, but the trouble is they don't live long enough to find out. Sometimes we start doing this too late, and that's why I hope in the hereafter we can discuss some of these things and they not just be blotted out. But I think if 40 years later we're doing it the way our folks did it, many of the things that our folks used to do, because we would concede we have never found a better way. Of course, it's nice if we can live long enough, or our children can do this soon enough that we can observe it. And well, to the extent this has been true with us, it's been so interesting to watch our three married daughters now continuing at least some of the things that we used to do at home, though I think they feel very free to do whatever they want to do. And there's great satisfaction in that. I'm glad they've been discriminating, though. I would be worried if I thought they were doing this for the wrong reason, or were just feeling under obligation. They've got to do it the same way as long as we're alive to watch, because they wouldn't want to disappoint us. That wouldn't be very satisfying. But they have actually, because we discussed it before they left home, they feel free to discuss it now. And even to say what almost seems trite. You know, when we were little, we thought some of the things you were doing didn't make sense, and now we're doing the very same things at home because now they do make sense. I like the sound of that, and they can say that on a few points anyway. I think with God, the greatest satisfaction comes to God when we can say, we do what we do as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists because increasingly we find it to be right and sensible to do so. But don't stop there. How we reverence and admire and worship and are grateful toward the one who so advised us and even commanded us in the days of our ignorance and immaturity. Hastening to add, being still somewhat ignorant and immature, we're willing to obey this same person whose advice has proved to make such good sense when he presently commands us to do things beyond our present understanding. For aren't there still a few rules in the book for which we have not accumulated all the evidence that we would like to? I may have mentioned this earlier, but I was so impressed one day when Dr. Wareham, head of our heart team, there's a man of competence and intelligence and skill, telling me one day during one of the alumni postgraduate conventions, when some new information had come to light about the effect of nicotine on the nervous system, he said, you know, Ellen White made that observation years and years ago. And he said, in view of the fact that so much of what she said so long ago has proved now to be demonstrably true, he said, I would feel foolish not to follow her advice in those few remaining areas still awaiting demonstration and proof. I think that makes good sense. So when giving that obedience number 3, I would want to add all those qualifications at the end. I think that's why Abraham could say, when God asked him to sacrifice his son, God, I know it's you speaking. You don't often ask me to do things that don't immediately make sense, for this one doesn't. This is the son of the promise. I mean, how could you ask me to sacrifice him? How will you then fulfill your promise that through Isaac the world would be greatly blessed? But God, I'm not hesitating here. I'm on my way. But as I go, would you mind if I asked you questions, if I thought this through? Because I'm asking these questions in confidence, because I know you so well, that if I think this through long enough and allow you to help me enough, I will eventually discover that this will make just as much good sense as anything else you've asked me to do. And as it says in Hebrews, after 3 days and 3 sleepless nights, Abraham came to the conclusion that God would either raise his son or he'd provide a substitute sacrifice. It's mentioned in Hebrews, and Abraham was absolutely right. But because he had discovered from experience that the things God asked him to do made such good sense in his life's experience, when God asked him to do something that he couldn't understand at the time, he said, God, I'm on my way. May I reverently ask questions, because I know this will make sense. It'll take me a little while to find out. In the realm of health, hasn't a lot of this proved true in recent years, particularly? Dr. Harding and Dr. Register, you've probably heard them from our School of Health, the most interesting illustrations they can give of advice on the subject of health from Ellen White, now rather generally accepted in the world of health, but not so years ago. Some were thought to be rather amusing. I think, by the way, that would suggest one way in which one could test whether one is a legalist or not by asking oneself, why do I obey this or that regulation? For example, why do we keep the seventh-day Sabbath, really, when you come down to it?
I'm glad you brought that up. I have no problem with why we keep it today.
Yes.
But why was it the seventh day?
I think there are many reasons. But I think with all these doctrines and questions, the most important thing is to put them in the setting of the whole great controversy. And if you do that and go back to the beginning, I think we're able to put the Sabbath in such a setting that the seventh dayness of it seems utterly unarbitrary. When you recall how in the beginning, as the universe was created, and think how much was created before this little world of ours was, there stood by the side of God in a position of incredible honor for a mere creature, the one called the light bearer, Lucifer. And in Ezekiel, you remember, and in Isaiah, he's pictured, there were just a creature as standing in the stones of fire, right in the very presence of God, one of the covering cherubs. Ellen White enlarges on this. In the presence of the Father, there stood to his right the Son, is equally divine with him. To his left, not another divine person, but a mere creature, to indicate the honor and respect God wished to show to his, quotes, mere creatures. He's treated us rather as sons, almost as gods, and he elevated this creature to stand there with him and to be one of his representatives. And Ellen White says, Satan knew God, I shouldn't call him Satan yet, Lucifer, the light bearer, the morning star. That was his name. Same name as Christ had on the other side. Light bearer, morning star, Lucifer. It's a good name, not a bad one. He knew God so well that he was foremost in explaining the purposes of God to the angels and to the rest of the universe. He knew God that well, but he was a mere creature. And so when God purposed to create yet another world, this time ours, and he entered into divine consultation with the other members of the Godhead over the creation of this world, and that's interesting to think about. I mean, how in human language can we explain God going into consultation? But Ellen White gives us the picture. Satan, no, still Lucifer, the light bearer, was not included. He became deeply offended over this. He felt he was not being treated with proper respect. Though Ellen White suggests the observation that the reason why Satan was not included in the creation council was that he had nothing to contribute. He was just a creature himself. He began to forget his creatureliness, though. By the way, what comes every 7 days to remind us that we do happen to be creatures, though greatly honored by God? One of the first things Lucifer forgot was what the Sabbath comes every week to remind us of. Do you find it humiliating, though, to realize we are just creatures? Ever wake up at 2 in the morning and feel covered with humiliation? Think of God insulting us by making us creatures. Those are foolish words. I mean, how else can you make anybody? The marvel is that God created us and then made us so like himself, even creating us with power to think and to do, with individuality and all these other things. Well, Lucifer became so offended. His creatureliness became very humiliating to him, and he went out among the angels to try to win their worship of him as God. And in order to win their allegiance to him, he had to turn them against God. And he said, God does not respect us as he should. Particularly, he does not respect me as he should. And you know, this thing came to the place where eventually, for the good of the whole onlooking universe, God had to separate Satan and his followers. And he now was Satan, the adversary. And he was expelled from heaven. The issue was over the creation of this world, the fact that he was not treated as a God. By the way, does he want to be treated as a God? Look at the references in Scripture. He even asked the other covering cherub, Jesus, in the wilderness to bow down and worship him. There's no doubt in Scripture that Lucifer wishes to be thought of as God and to be worshipped as God. And he persuaded 1/3 of the angels to so regard him. And they left heaven together with their accepting him as their deity. Revelation 13 says, in the end, the whole world will be worshiping the same person. He craves and covets worship as a God. After Satan and his fallen angels were cast out of heaven, Ellen White says, God purposed to go ahead with the creation of this world. He had not done it yet, though Revelation says Satan was cast out to this earth, but it hadn't been created yet. That's interesting to think about. After Satan was cast out of heaven, we don't have any text for this, but it is interesting to think about. What do you suppose he was doing? We do know he was trying to secure the allegiance of the whole universe, was he not? His temptations extended throughout the universe. His misrepresentations of God circulated everywhere. It was a great threat to the whole universe. How do you suppose he maintained the allegiance and worship of the fallen angels? Now, these are brilliant beings. Think how we trust angels now to look after us. These were brilliant beings that fell with him, and yet he had to seem so superior to them that he could maintain their worship. I wonder what he did. Oh, I sometimes speculate. I hope it's sanctified speculation. It was over creation that he was insulted. I wonder if he even tried his hand, maybe. When the pictures came back from the moon, I began to wonder that maybe that's one place he tried. I mean, I can't imagine God making the moon like that. God creates Edens, beautiful things. What happened there? And the pictures from Mars don't seem much better, or any of these others. Do be assured I have absolutely no text for this. I just wonder. Except that Ellen White drops little hints. They're very little because it's not essential at all to be convinced of this or to have this settled. What we know is he was cast out. We know what the issue was. We know he maintained the loyalty of his angels. I just wonder what he did. We do know, though, that when creation week began, this earth was in a condition described in the Hebrew as tohu vavohu, emptiness and wasteness. I wonder, how was it when God began? Is it possible there was chaos here as a result of Satan's efforts? I don't know. But suffice it to say, when God determined to go ahead with his original plan, he did it in a very public way. He assembled the onlooking universe, for did not the sons of God watch, and were they not greatly pleased with what they saw? So the universe before whose eyes the great controversy had begun, in whose ears Satan's charges had been lodged against God, that God was selfish and demanding and was not respectful of the freedom of his creatures, that he was a selfish, tyrannical deity, God began to unfold this earth of ours. And he may not have done any other world in this whole universe the same way, because this is the only earth created after the great controversy has begun. There are now questions to be answered. And God approaches this spot in the universe. I don't think we need to argue what was here. Anything that was here was originally created by God, that's for sure. And God began Genesis 1. And the first day God said simply, with the universe looking on, "Let there be light." Why so little? When he could have snapped his fingers and there would have been a whole earth full of birds and animals and Adam and Eve, maybe full of people. He could have done anything he liked just by speaking. And all he did was to say, "Let there be light." And there was one day. And then there was day 2. Just a little more progress. And then day 3. And can you imagine the accumulating interest of the universe watching as gradually the earth became more beautiful, till finally here was this magnificent garden, and the rest of the world was magnificent. And then these beautiful creatures, and they must have begun to say to each other, God seems to be building a beautiful place for somebody. It doesn't look like a selfish God making it so beautiful. And then on Friday, he created a man and a woman. And Ellen White says we are of a distinct order, doesn't she? Doesn't say any more about it, because to haggle over this would be a real waste of time. But the little hints, I think, help create the setting for the seventh-day Sabbath. We may be the only people in the universe who are the way we are, because this was a very eloquent way by which God could answer some of these questions in the great controversy and help us to understand the predicament in which sin had put him and his government as he sought to maintain a free universe. And so on Friday, here this magnificent man and this magnificent woman, and God made them as much like himself as he could. He created us in his image, as in our very fine Sabbath school lessons this quarter. And our image is our individuality, our power to think and to do. And he created them free. He created them capable of rebelling against him. And more than that, to show how he wanted to maintain their freedom, he put the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and right nearby he put an opportunity to rebel. He put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It also means that he put an opportunity there for Satan to approach them. Now that must have taken the wind out of Satan's sails for a while. Why would God give me that chance to approach them? Because God could easily have said, Satan and your evil angels, you may never come near these people. I refuse to allow you. And God could easily have done it. That's not the way God runs his universe. He put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil right there so that when they went to the tree of life, which they needed to do, they saw the other. But we know that God does not allow a person to be tested or tempted more than he's able to bear. That's the way he is. And so God said to Satan, you may only approach them at that tree. They were not strong enough yet, like Job, to resist him face to face. So God simply said to Adam and Eve, don't go near the tree. It will not be safe. If you stay away from the tree, Satan cannot approach you. If you go over there, you'll be overmastered. Don't go there. So that tree was there for protection. But look what it says about freedom. God created these beings with marvelous freedom, individuality, power to think and to do. He even gave Satan an opportunity to approach them. And I can see onlooking beings saying, what's all this about God not respecting our freedom? He even gives Satan a chance to represent his cause there. But God wasn't through yet. With this magnificent setting, with these individuals created obviously free, with this gesture towards Satan even, before the eyes of the onlooking universe, that he was going to give him a chance to represent his side of the great controversy, he then endowed us with an incredible power. For one of the charges of Satan was that God really demeans us as mere creatures and did not include him in the counsel to create this earth. And God went, it seems to me, as far as the Creator God could possibly go to make creatures creators. And he so arranged it that if all goes well, a man and a woman can create people in their own image. And it's a very, as you know, impressive experience to have one of these little creatures and watch them grow up in our own image. And not only do they resemble us in form and feature, but in so many other ways. Unfortunately, at this stage, both good and bad, which is sometimes amusing and sometimes deplorable. But we also discover the influence we have over these people, and yet how eventually they grow up to be free, and some of them stay and some of them leave as far as their loyalty to the things we believe in. God really invited us to enter into his experience. But think of sharing with us the power to create to that extent. It seems to me by Friday sundown, Satan had suffered an overwhelming defeat. And the onlooking universe said, this is not only good, this is very good. Where are these charges that God is selfish and demanding and doesn't respect the freedom of his creatures and won't share his divine power with his creatures? Could you name anything God could have given beyond what he did? Could he have gone any further except to make us not God? Well, you can't. I mean, if you create somebody, he's going to be a creature. We do happen to be creatures. But God has made us like gods as far as he possibly can. So that Friday night was a great victory for God in the great controversy there at the beginning, it seems to me. And God said, I'm not quite through yet. I declare the next day a holiday, a holy day. It's not that I'm tired. The Lord never grows weary. He rested. That means he stopped doing what he'd been doing for 6 days. He also asked the whole universe to stop doing what they were doing and join him in considering the significance of what he had done. Think of the answers God gave in the great controversy during those 6 days of creation week. And so they kept the seventh day of that week, but it wasn't Adam's seventh day nor Eve's. It was their second day. The interesting thing is that the first seventh-day Sabbath was not our seventh day at all. It was God's. It was the onlooking universe's seventh day. It was our second day. I would say the burden of proof rests very heavily on those who want to change it to some other day. It's after God had observed it and the universe had observed it, and they had spent that day celebrating victory in the great controversy. After that, God said to Adam and Eve, since the great controversy will largely be fought out on your planet, on your world, you will need to stop at least once a week, as we have done, and consider the significance of what occurred this week. And you know, if every seventh-day Sabbath, from then till now, we had stopped and considered God's answers to Satan in the great controversy, think where we would be now. Think what our attitude would be toward God. And our attitude toward ourselves as created in his image with power to be individuals and to think and to do. What respect we would have for this capacity to create in our own image. But when you think of the things that have been most perverted and twisted and destroyed during the history of mankind, would you not say that sex, this marvelous capacity and ability that God gave us to say something, this has been one of them, hasn't it? And the Sabbath, for example, of all things that religious people do, has anything been more encrusted with misunderstanding? Our best Christian friends deplore this evidence of our legalism, the willingness of our Seventh-day Adventists to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. How misunderstood the Sabbath has been, and freedom has been, and this ability to procreate has been. These great, significant, eloquent gifts that God gave us that first week, obviously Satan has sought to pervert and destroy. So it's no wonder that those things have been so twisted. And when you speak of this ability to procreate that God gave us, is it not significant that in the mystery religions, in the ancient religions of the worship of fertility, this marvelous ability we have was so grossly perverted? You may never have the stomach to do it, but read the records of the worship of fertility. This marvelous ability turned into something so gross in the name of religion. Well, it's in the Bible. Paul ran into this in the city of Corinth and mentions it. Well, look in the Old Testament, some of the things that were being done. So to say that the seventh day is arbitrary means that it doesn't have any real meaning or justification. It's just that God thought, let me see what else would be good for them. Well, yes, let's have a Sabbath. Which day shall we have? Well, I suppose the seventh would do. No. The third wouldn't have said what the seventh does. The sixth wouldn't have said what the seventh does. In the light of the history of the great controversy and of this planet, the seventh day is the only one that has these meanings. And we should have observed them ever since in this way. God went right on from that when we got into trouble and abused all these things. And we're in a deplorable condition. And he could well have said, well, nobody would miss this little planet. Why don't I just blot it out? But he's gone to all these lengths to heal and restore us. And he says to us, you know, you can't overcome sin by yourself. Sin is like a disease. You need a healer. In fact, it will be a great creative act of healing to restore you sinners in the condition you're in. And I'm willing to do it. So the same God who had the creative power to make us in the first place, now in the predicament we're in says, look, I haven't lost my creative power. I can't force you to do this, but if you'll only come back and be willing to listen and trust me, I can heal you. And so salvation is by faith in this Creator God. And that's why we have the additional verses. The Sabbath is to remind us that God is the one who sanctifies us, that salvation is not by works, it's by faith in this Creator God. It almost takes more creative power to heal damaged people than to create brand new ones in the beginning. And then as God goes on through the Bible, he gives more and more reasons for the Sabbath, till finally we come to Hebrews and he says, you know, the Sabbath is designed to remind you that just as I created you perfectly in the beginning in that beautiful place, and I'm working to recreate and heal you now, so someday, when this is all over, I will recreate this world, Eden will be restored, and you will enter into my Sabbath-like rest. And it'll be as if we haven't had these 6,000 years. I'm sorry about these 6,000 years. I wish we could go right back and tie into that first Sabbath, that Sabbath-like rest of the Sabbath at the end of creation week. Can you imagine the feelings throughout the universe? The feelings of Adam and Eve, so healthy, so free. They hadn't even tried some of their powers. But knowing they could create in their own image. God said, be fruitful and multiply. They must have, well, what on earth will that be like? It was later on they found what it's like to have children, and they grew up to be like them. The one grew up to be a murderer. I mean, you imagine the feelings of Adam and Eve that first Sabbath. And in Hebrews 4, we're told that the seventh-day Sabbath is a type of the final Sabbath-like rest to come, when this world is recreated and Eden is restored, and we carry on as in the beginning, though hopefully much wiser for this experience, and the universe even more secure because of this experience. It seems to me the Sabbath is tied in all the way along with accumulating meanings. In fact, it has so many meanings, it's the least arbitrary. It has so many meanings attached to it, the way I see it. But then we'll sometimes say, well, but when your back's to the wall, it's a matter of whether or not you are going to do what you're told. Now, this is the clearest command of all. Sundown to sundown. It's not for you to ask any questions. It's for you to do what you're told. The test of obedience at the end will be whether or not you're going to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Then we really have destroyed the thing. That was the attitude of many before in the time of Christ, and that made it possible for people to reject Christ's gracious explanation of the Sabbath, kill him, and then dash home to keep another Sabbath because, they had to keep it. Had to keep it. Had a very interesting experience the last few weeks. The explanation I give of the Sabbath and my freedom in the little book, I Want to Be Free, Elder Hegstad printed in Liberty magazine. And the letters that have come in from rabbis and other devout Jews, they are no less than incensed over the suggestion that they have ever been legalistic in their observance of the Sabbath. I wish you could read. Well, in Liberty there are several letters this month. Why we have never been legalistic in our observance of the Sabbath. Well, I just think of what Jesus said, but they reject what Jesus said as false. I think what Paul said, they reject that as false. But I'm going to point out that Amos said the same. And Isaiah said, your worship of me is but the commandments of men learned by rote. Their most revered prophets deplored their legalism. It's just that many people who, and rightly, defend the reputation of the Jews today. They should. I mean, we shouldn't be most respectful of the Jews. They are not believers in Scripture. A great share of Jews today do not accept the Scriptures as we Christians do. See, we accept their prophets and the New Testament, the whole thing. And it was the prophets to Israel that deplored their legalism. Anyway, I anticipate some interesting exchanges. But unfortunately, you see, I think we often represent the Sabbath legalistically too, and that's most regrettable, and we repent and are sorry that we've done that.
In the view of all of this great significance of the Sabbath often seems to be, for many Adventists, the major day in which they make their evangelistic thrust. I mean, this is the day they go and pass afternoon and Sabbath afternoon. Do we do these things on God's time rather than our own time, so to speak? I mean, we don't have time to do it on Tuesday night and Monday night and so forth because we're doing other things, but there's so many things that we will do on the Sabbath because, well, then, what else is there to do? We'll do it. We'll give God this time.
Yes, that suggests many problems that get into the realm of what one thinks deep down inside. How can one determine what is right to do on the Sabbath and whether one is doing it for the right reason so that at the end, how often at worship time we ask the Lord to forgive us if we have not kept the Sabbath as we should. Often we're not specific because we're not entirely sure whether we kept it as we should or not, but we do want to take out a little insurance there and say, if we haven't kept it right, please forgive us. It's like the prayer that's often asked, and forgive us for all the sins that we haven't mentioned, sort of a general coverage. Can one know if one has had a good Sabbath or not? Can one tell?
What is our work? I mean, we've been given the Great Commission. Is our work to be a teacher or a nurse or whatever? Or is that the way we make our living? Is our work giving the commission? Isn't this basically the work of a Christian?
Well, would you understand it this way, that no matter what our specialty and our gifts vary and our backgrounds vary, so we wind up doing all kinds of different things, which is a very good thing, because supposing we were all plumbers and you needed an electrician, isn't it a good thing that we have all these different gifts and interests? But is there not one thing that we have in common as Christians and as Adventists? The commission, go into all the world and spread the good news, has come to everybody, not so much as a command as really a description of what a person will do if he's proud of the good news and feels indebted as Paul did. And one doesn't turn this on and off. I mean, one either does this or he doesn't. I think the important thing to realize is that two saints could be sitting side by side in Sabbath school, on time, lesson studied 7 times, nothing forbidden or indigestible in the stomach, a double tithe paid, and you both just volunteered to take bands out for literature distribution in the afternoon, and what else could we name that would be very virtuous? And one is a legalist and no friend of God, and the other one is on the high road to the kingdom. Now, we know that's true because of things Jesus said to that effect. And he talked about that group who will arise so sadly and find it's the wrong resurrection, expecting to be saved, and says, "Go away, I never knew you." Well, they said, "But we worked hard. We did the right things. We have done many wonderful works in your name. We've even cast out devils in your name." He says, "I know you have, but go away. I never knew you." In the biblical sense, we never were friends. We never knew each other. You did the right things, but you did them for the wrong reason. That's what indicates how subtle this can be, so that one might say, "I've just checked myself and I'm no legalist," and maybe one is. Does that mean we can't know? Do we have to go to an analyst to find out if we're legalists or not? Are there symptoms we can look for? Are there guidelines we can follow? We want to avoid legalism, the way it's described. Yes.
Something that really impressed me was what I had read in Christ and His righteousness
Yes.
about the legalistic attitude. He said that those who, when they're in meetings together, that all they can think about is about their failings, and their testimonies don't arise above that, and sometimes they're even afraid to approach God in prayer. And they wait till the vivid sense of their sin is past, and then after a few days perhaps they'll say, "Surely God will accept me now, because I've done so well these last few days."
Thinking, say, of extreme cases where individuals have sought to atone and do penance for their sins, they really want to be saved, they really want to be forgiven, they really want to make things right with God, and in their system of thought, this means you have to go and do certain things. Maybe you're guilty of some sin, you have confessed it, and you're now told that you should go and repeat something 12 times. Now, how could you judge whether that's a legalistic thing to do or not? I mean, there are millions of people who do this kind of thing. I had a friend that I admired for years who used to belong to a church that required this, and he said he was always there first thing in the morning so he could get his confessions out of the way and be off to play golf the rest of the day. And he said he felt so good because now he knew that everything was straight for another week. You know, and you know the feeling, this is caricaturing, and I know there are many devout folk in that church who are not that loose with it. But he understood this was the arrangement, you know. You could unload yourself for the week, and now you had a fresh slate, and you knew you would accumulate some more sins, but you could always take care of this. You could always take care of it in this way. In the last analysis, though, what would this imply about God? Personally, I believe that whether or not one is a legalist is determined by one's conception of God. I believe a legalist has a legalistic God who is satisfied with a different kind of obedience from the kind I find Christ recommending. For example, you remember the picture of the saints in Revelation as having the name of the Father in their foreheads? And Ellen White, who understood this so well, says that name represents intelligent obedience. And in Christ's Object Lessons, you remember she says, "He who obeys God from a sense of obligation, merely because he is required to do so." Well, wouldn't that be humble? No, she says, he never enters into the joy of obedience. In fact, he does not obey. Only the man who does what's right because it is right really obeys and really pleases God. For God wants us to do what's right as mature adults now. Little children have to do what's right because they're told to, and often stimulated by fear of punishment and promise of reward. That's a proper place to start, and we've learned this as parents and teachers, and we should be able to sympathize with God, talking as he did in Deuteronomy. But with grown-ups, God wants us to do what's right because it is right. Then he knows we will do it of our own free will. We would do it even if he didn't ask us to. Then he can trust us to be of the number that shall make up the society of the universe for eternity. It was in this connection that I wrote this little piece some time ago. Let me try it again and see if it fits. If God is the gracious person we believe him to be, we're all agreed on that. Who would have a reservation about that? Then why does he make such extensive use of law and warn us of legalism, as Paul does? If this really is a free universe, and God can accept only love and faith that are freely given, I mean, anything else would be insulting to our gracious God, then why does he have so much to say about law, with all the hazards of a legalistic, meaningless obedience, which God has been offered through the centuries? Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And then we think of all our Adventist rules and regulations and wonder how that burden could be described as light. At least our children sometimes don't find it light. But Jesus also had much to say about the continuing authority of God's law and the benefits that come to those who are willing to keep all his commandments. He emphasized this from the beginning of his public ministry, as in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember his words? "For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But he who does them and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And Jesus was still emphasizing obedience at the end of his ministry. "If you love me, you will keep my commandments," he urged his disciples in the upper room. And on the way out to the Garden of Gethsemane, that late, he added, "If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. You are my friends if you do what I command you." Now, what kind of friendship is it that demands obedience? How does "keep my commandments" fit with "the truth will set you free"? It does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it? I believe that one's understanding of God's use of law has much to do with one's conception of God himself and hence the quality of one's relationship with him. Some 1,400 years after the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, Jesus came to live among the people who had been entrusted with this revelation of God's will. And he found a people who were very much preoccupied with God's law and obedience to its every detail. Has anyone ever tried to be more obedient to every detail of the law given on Sinai? Jesus never had to tell those people not to set up any graven image. Is that ever mentioned in the Gospels? They had shunned idolatry since learning their lesson in Babylonian captivity. Nor did he have to tell them which day was the Sabbath, or that in it they should not do any work. They saw it as their highest duty to keep all 10 of the 10 commandments. Nor did Jesus have to urge them to pay tithe. They even tithed such small items as mint, dill, and cumin, or to obey the Old Testament laws of hygiene. They were careful to strain the gnat from a drink, lest they swallow a forbidden insect, or to read the Scriptures. They searched them diligently to find eternal life, Jesus said in John 5:39, or to be careful in their association with unbelievers. They even performed certain cleansing rituals on returning from the marketplace and shrank from eating with the Gentiles. They could say with the rich young ruler, "We have obeyed all these laws since our youth." In the face of such rigor and devotion, one might have thought the Lord would be pleased. But all heaven watched the extraordinary scene of people claiming to love the law while hating the lawgiver. Jesus ventured to suggest that they were obeying for the wrong reason, and as a result, they were not really obeying at all, that their picture of God was in error, that if they knew the truth about God, they would obey, but for a different reason, a reason that would make it possible for them to be obedient and free at the same time. The Old Testament prophets had dealt with this problem centuries before. Amos and Isaiah had chided the people for their reluctant Sabbath keeping, their rote obedience and worship. When Jesus came, he quoted Isaiah, you remember, and commended him for preaching the truth. "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men.'" Then Jesus set out to tell the truth about his Father and the kind of obedience that is really pleasing to him. You recall what he did on the Sabbath. It was all innocent and good. But those gloomy legalists were shocked. They accused him of disobeying the law. Think of the lawgiver being denounced as a lawbreaker. No, Jesus replied, think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. By teaching and example, Jesus had come to correct the misunderstanding of God's law, to show them what it was all about. He explained that the law was made for people, to be an advantage to them. Particularly was this true of the Sabbath, Jesus affirmed, as he defended the right of his hungry disciples to pick a few ears of grain. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It was never meant to be a burden, a mere test of obedience. If only you knew the truth about God and his laws, Jesus urged, you would find that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, for he wants you to be free. But the people accused him of blasphemously misrepresenting God. They condemned him as lawless and crucified him as a heretic. Then the Apostle Paul took up the cause. At first, he too obeyed for the wrong reason, for he worshipped a tyrannical God who would be pleased to see people persecuted and imprisoned to force them to obey. Then he saw the light, and the truth set him free. And who has written more eloquently about freedom, love, and grace, and that faith is the only requirement for heaven, and that we're not under law but under grace, and that Christ is the end of legalism as a way of being saved? Of course, don't misunderstand me, Paul seems to be saying in Romans 3:31. Does faith abolish law? Perish the thought. Faith establishes law by putting it in its proper perspective. For adopting Paul's understanding of faith, the man who really knows, loves, and trusts God and admires God for his wise and orderly ways is most willing to listen and give heed to God's instructions on any subject. Let me tell you, continued Paul, why our gracious Lord, who wants us to feel the joy and dignity of freedom, made so much use of law. Why then the law, he wrote to the Galatians? It was added because of transgressions, Galatians 3:19. It was designed to be our guardian, our custodian, to bring us back to a right relationship with God. And how we sinners, in our rebelliousness, our immaturity, and our disorderliness, have needed the guidance and protection of God's law. The King James Version describes the law as our schoolmaster in Galatians 3, which might imply that the law itself is our teacher. The Greek word Paul used, you remember when we discussed these verses in Galatians, the Greek word Paul used is paidagogos, which it is true is the source of our English word pedagogue. But in the first century, it was a term for a trusted slave whose duty it was to take the children to school. He was to protect them on their way and make sure that they arrived. Now read this meaning back into Paul's letter to the Galatians. Before this faith came, we were kept locked up under the law, in preparation for the faith which was to be unveiled. So the law has been our attendant to lead us to Christ, so that we might, through faith, obtain right standing with God. But now that this faith has come, we are no longer in charge of the attendant, for all of you are sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. And I use there Williams' translation. Now, this is not an easy passage to translate. Remember, we looked at many versions several weeks ago. And it's very enlightening to compare the various versions of these important verses. One thing, however, stands out clearly through them all: the beneficent purpose and function of God's law, but only if rightly understood. When Paul spoke of the law like this, he ran into the same opposition Jesus did, the same stubborn preference for tradition, the same unwillingness to give truth a fair hearing or to move in any new direction where the evidence might lead. The great apostle was even a puzzle to some of his fellow Christian leaders, you recall. No one could fault his obedience, but how could he be such a law-abiding believer and feel so individual and free. Even the saints couldn't make sense out of that in the early days. It's just that Paul had learned the truth that sets saints free. Some 1,800 years later, there arose a group of Christians whose ambitious goal it was to take the good news, the gospel, to the whole world so that the end might come. They said much about truth, faith, and love. But they also stressed obedience to God's law, and we're famous for this, aren't we? They even sought to revive the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, thus leading some of their Christian friends to question their freedom and faith. They spent a long time studying the function of God's law. Which law was designed to bring men to Christ? Was it perhaps the law of ceremonies, with all its symbolism of salvation to come? Surely it couldn't be the moral law of the Ten Commandments, for that would suggest that for the faithful Christian, it need no longer be obeyed. Someone put the question to Ellen White, respected counselor and spokesman for the group. "I am asked concerning the law in Galatians," she replied. "What law is the schoolmaster to bring us to Christ?" I answer, both the ceremonial and the moral code of 10 Commandments. In fact, she emphasized further, in this scripture, the Holy Spirit, through the apostle, is speaking especially of the moral law. The law reveals sin to us and causes us to feel our need of Christ and to flee unto him for pardon and peace by exercising repentance toward God and faith toward our Lord Jesus Christ. And she went on to explain that the law of 10 Commandments is not to be looked upon as much from the prohibitory side as from the mercy side. To the obedient, it is a wall of protection. We behold in it the goodness of God, who by revealing to men the immutable principles of righteousness seeks to shield them from the evils that result from transgression. All those were her words. Then she stated the truth about God and his treatment of sinners that so many seem to find impossible to believe. Quoting her again, "We are not to regard God as waiting to punish the sinner for his sin. The sinner brings the punishment upon himself. His own actions start a train of circumstances that bring the sure result. Every act of transgression reacts upon the sinner, works in him a change of character, and makes it more easy for him to transgress again. By choosing to sin, men separate themselves from God, cut themselves off from the channel of blessing, and the sure result is ruin and death." The reason some of us hold her writings in such high regard is that Ellen White always spoke so well of God. She recognized that God has given many laws, but behind these requirements, we must see a gracious God who has given them only for man's best good. There is nothing arbitrary about them. They make good sense and deserve to be intelligently obeyed. Because these laws make such good sense, it should be no surprise that failure to obey such wise regulations will produce undesirable results, but not at the hands of an angry God. He is grieved and disappointed when his creatures do not have sufficient faith or sufficient sense to follow their Creator's advice. Sometimes, to attract our attention, to warn us of danger, to help us break a destructive habit, God will discipline those whom he loves. But like an earthly parent, whenever God ventures to chasten his children, he runs the risk of being at least temporarily feared, even hated, and perhaps obeyed for the wrong reason. But because he cares enough, this is a risk he is willing to run, and the Bible is a record of it. Then if we persistently refuse, if we insist on having our own disorderly way, what alternative is there in a free universe than for God to let us go, to give us up, to turn us over to the awful but natural consequences of our rebellious choice? To spare us from eternal death, Jesus died on Calvary. And as he died, he did not ask, "God, why are you killing me?" He cried, my God, Why hast thou forsaken me? Why have you given me up? Why have you let me go? Though he had never been disorderly for a moment, Jesus was experiencing the consequences of disorderliness in God's orderly universe. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, 2 Corinthians 5. He was given up and handed over for our trespasses. You remember Romans 4:25. There is no clearer picture of God than may be seen from the foot of the cross. God had told the truth when he warned that the wages of sin is death. In his Son, he was dying that death. But God was not executing his Son. He only gave him up, as he will give up the wicked at the end. And though by rights we should have died, God did not ask us to prove the truthfulness of his word. He sacrificed himself in his Son. What more could God do to warn us from our sin and win us back to faith? So if you are a believer and are seeking to do God's will, what makes you willing to obey? Could you say, I do what I do because God has told me to, and he has the power to reward and destroy? Is this why you don't murder or commit adultery? Because God has said you mustn't. You would otherwise, but you can't afford to incur his displeasure. This might be all right for a beginner or for a child, but it suggests that God's laws are arbitrary and do not make good sense in themselves. And this does not speak very favorably of God. Would you rather say, I do what I do as a believer because God has told me to, and I love him and want to please him? Is this why you don't steal or tell lies? You would see nothing wrong or harmful about doing these things. It's just that you want so much to please God. For some reason, he doesn't like it when you steal or lie. And since he has been so good to us, you feel under some obligation to please him. It would only be grateful and fair. Again, this might be all right for a beginner or a child. It might even be progress beyond the obedience prompted only by fear of punishment and desire of reward. But it still implies an arbitrariness in God's commandments and does not speak so well of his character and government. There is another possible approach to obedience. Could you say this? I do what I do because I have found it to be right and sensible to do so. And I have increasing admiration and reverence for the one who so advised and even commanded me in the days of my ignorance and immaturity. Then hastening to add, being still somewhat ignorant and immature, I am willing to trust and obey the one whose counsel has always proved to be so sensible when he commands me to do something beyond my present understanding. When God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, Abraham knew God well enough first to recognize his voice and next to obey at once so incredible a command. But on the long journey to the place of sacrifice, Abraham respectfully questioned why. And as he thought it through in the light of his knowledge of God, he came to the conclusion that God would either provide a substitute or resurrect his son. Abraham was right, Hebrews 11:19. By their observance of the seventh-day Sabbath, Seventh-day Adventists have become known for their emphasis on obedience to the Ten Commandments. Others looking on have quite naturally wondered about our appreciation of Christian freedom, our acceptance of God's grace. No doubt there are many among us who offer an obedience that misrepresents our God. But at its heart, the Seventh-day Adventist Church espouses this forthright declaration of Ellen White: the man who attempts to keep the commandments of God from a sense of obligation merely, because he is required to do so, will never enter into the joy of obedience. He does not obey. True obedience is the outworking of a principle within. It springs from the love of righteousness, the love of the law of God. The essence of all righteousness is loyalty to our Redeemer. This will lead us to do right because it is right, because right doing is pleasing to God. I, for example, choose not to drink or smoke, but this is not because of some scriptural command, though with my confidence in the trustworthiness of that book, that would be reason enough for a start, wouldn't it? But in this scientific age, the evidence is sufficient to convince me of my own free will to forego these hazardous indulgences. Someday, I believe, we could stand in God's presence and reverently say, God, we would do all these things whether you asked us to or not, just because they make good sense, because in themselves they are right. And the Father might reply, at last you are fully free. You have learned the truth, and the truth has set you free. People who offer such freely given obedience are proud of God and his ways. They can speak well of God and are glad to do so in any company. It is Satan who has pictured God as arbitrary and harsh and has claimed that his laws do not make sense. Every gloomy legalist offers his support to Satan's charges. What a risk God ran every time he added another law of being misunderstood. But he knew we needed the protection. As sinners, we still need protection. And for our sakes, God is still willing to run this risk. But now, we who have profited from obedience to God's laws should especially be the ones to clear God's reputation of any charge of legalism and correct any misunderstanding of the purpose of his laws. If we have discovered the joy of being both obedient and free, if we have learned the truth that sets saints free, then I believe it is our privilege to join with the loyal angels, with Amos, Isaiah, Paul, and Jesus Christ in telling the truth about our gracious, orderly, and trustworthy God. In sum, I believe that whether or not we are legalists is like everything else determined by the kind of person we believe our God to be.